You know, I've heard countless stories of HOA overreach. The meticulously measured lawn heights, the forbidden garden gnomes, the absurd demands about mailbox color. But never, not in a million years, did I imagine my own quiet community would become the battleground for a fight over history itself. A fight that involved a forgotten building, a ruthless HOA president, and a secret so dark it threatened to unravel the very fabric of our suburban paradise. Drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from, because this story isn't just about an HOA trying to tear something down. It's about what happens when you disturb sleeping ghosts and uncover truths some people would kill to keep buried. It all began, as these things often do, with an election. Our HOA, the Maplewood Heights Community Association, had always been a sleepy, almost charmingly ineffective body. They managed the common areas, occasionally fixed a broken sprinkler, and mostly left everyone alone. They were the kind of HOA that sent out polite, almost apologetic notices about overgrown hedges, not threats of legal action. But then Beatrice Bea Maxwell moved in. Bea was a woman who clearly believed her ascension to HOA president was akin to a coronation. She was probably in her late 50s, with a helmet of suspiciously immovable blonde hair and eyebrows perfectly sculpted, like tiny, angry caterpillars planning world domination. She wore confidence, like a slightly ill-fitting toupee. Noticeable, but doing its job. She had this way of looking at you, like she was constantly assessing your compliance, even during casual conversations at the community picnic. Her very presence seemed to drain the casual friendliness from the air, replacing it with a subtle yet pervasive tension. Bea wasted no time implementing her vision: modernization through efficiency. Her first target, the old Maplewood Community Hall. The hall was an unassuming structure, tucked away near the edge of the development, almost hidden by a cluster of old oak trees. It was old, certainly, a bit creaky, with peeling paint and windows that always seemed to squint in the sun. A few cracked panes, a leaky roof that had left telltale water stains on the old wooden floorboards. Most residents, especially the newer ones, saw it as an eyesore, a relic to be forgotten. Some thought it was charmingly rustic, a quaint nod to a bygone era. But nobody actively used it anymore. It was mostly a storage space for old holiday decorations, a dusty repository for forgotten children's toys left over from decades of community events, and a haven for the occasional stray cat. Bea, however, saw not a building, but a prime piece of real estate. Think of the potential. She'd trill at HOA meetings, her smile plastered on, a cheap veneer over a house of cards. Her hands would flutter, gesturing grandly as she described her vision: a modern fitness center, with state-of-the-art equipment, or perhaps a sparkling new community pool. Imagine the property values. The community was easily swayed. Property values, after all, are the siren song of every suburban dream. Bea's presentations were slick, professional, filled with glossy renderings of a sleek, modern structure, surrounded by manicured lawns and smiling, fit residents. She promised a revitalized Maplewood, a place where property values would soar and amenities would be second to none. The vote to demolish the hall passed with overwhelming support. I voted against it, of course. Not because I had any grand attachment to the dusty old place, but because something about Bea's zeal felt off. As a retired architectural historian, I had a nose for forgotten stories in crumbling foundations. The hall just felt older than it seemed, its simple lines hinting at a past deeper than a mere community gathering spot. There was a certain weight to its silence, a whisper of untold narratives in its creaking timbers. My initial digging was quiet, almost a hobby. I started with the official records at the county clerk's office. They were sparse, listing the hall as built in the early 1950s, a standard post-war community project. It was so generic, almost deliberately so. But then, as I cross-referenced dates and land deeds, I stumbled upon a discrepancy. A subtle shift in the property lines, a mention of an earlier deed that seemed to describe the same parcel of land, but with a different name attached to the structure. And then, the breakthrough. An old newspaper clipping in the county archives dated much earlier, from the late 1920s. It referenced a Colored Citizens Benevolent Society hall at the exact same location. A chill went down my spine. Maplewood Heights, like many communities, had a complicated past. Segregation, unspoken divides, histories deliberately forgotten. My research expanded. Old maps, property deeds, town meeting minutes from before the development sprang up, even old census records and church bulletins. The more I dug, the more fragments I found. Obscure references to community events, fundraisers, even quiet protests held within those very walls. The initial feeling of offness solidified into a growing suspicion that Bea's modernization plans felt less about progress and more about erasure. Bea, meanwhile, was full steam ahead. She seemed to relish her new authority. Demolition permits were filed with remarkable speed. Contractors were hired. A firm, I later noted, that had a rather cozy relationship with Bea's husband's development company. She even started sending out weekly newsletters titled The Future of Maplewood, filled with breathless updates and glossy artist renderings of the gleaming new fitness center. Her personality was like an unskippable ad, pervasive and increasingly irritating. She'd patrol the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, her gaze piercing, as if seeking out the slightest deviation from her burgeoning list of unspoken rules. I decided to make an appearance at the next HOA board meeting, armed with my initial findings. I had copies of the newspaper clipping, the old deed, and a rough timeline of the hall's obscured history. I spoke calmly, presenting the evidence of the Benevolent Society, its founding, and its likely connection to the existing structure. Bea cut me off mid-sentence, her smile tight. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with faux politeness, "we appreciate your nostalgia, but old buildings are just that. Old, they accrue liabilities, not assets. They are a drain on our community's precious resources. This is about progress, not historical sentimentality." The board, a hand-picked group of Bea loyalists, nodded like bobbleheads, their expressions a mixture of feigned concern and blatant disinterest. I was dismissed, my concerns brushed aside as the sentimental ramblings of an old man. That's when the real escalation began. Bea, perhaps sensing my continued resistance, started finding petty violations. The kind of ridiculous, nitpicky stuff that makes you question your sanity. My mailbox was non-conforming, despite being the same one since I moved in. I received a certified letter demanding I repaint it to a more harmonious shade of off-white. My rose bushes, which I'd meticulously pruned for years, were suddenly overgrown and encroaching on common elements. I received a notice about ambient luminescence standards for my porch light, stating it was excessively bright and disrupting nocturnal harmony. It was ridiculous, absurd even, but it was also a clear message. Fall in line or be buried under paperwork and escalating fines. My initial fines were for $50, then $100. Then came the threat of a lien on my property if I didn't comply within 10 days. I realized this wasn't just about a building anymore. It was about power, control, and a systematic effort to silence any opposition. The game was on. I enlisted the help of Sarah, a young, tenacious investigative journalist from the local paper I'd mentored years ago. Sarah loved a good underdog story, especially when it involved a local Karen and a potential cover-up. She had that spark in her eyes, that hunger for truth that separates good journalists from great ones. I laid out everything for her. The documents, my suspicions, Bea's increasingly aggressive tactics. Sarah's eyes lit up. "This isn't just an HOA dispute, Mr. Harrison," she said. "This is a story about hidden history and abuse of power." Sarah started interviewing longtime residents, digging into the historical archives from a different angle, focusing on the social history of the area. She spent days at the local historical society, poring over microfiches and dusty ledgers. She found a pivotal piece of the puzzle, an old community registry from the 1930s, detailing members of the Colored Citizens Benevolent Society. It listed names, addresses, and occupations. Many of the addresses were right here in what was now Maplewood Heights. Crucially, she found an elderly resident, Mrs. Gable, whose grandparents had been among the founding members of the original Benevolent Society. Mrs. Gable was a quiet, dignified woman, sharp as a tack despite her age. She lived in a small, well-kept home just a few blocks from the hall. Mrs. Gable had old photographs, faded but clear, showing vibrant community gatherings, dances, and even a visit from a prominent civil rights leader in the 1940s, all taking place in the hall. That building, Mrs. Gable said, tears in her eyes as she gently traced the figures in a photograph, was the heart of our world when nobody else would have us. It was our sanctuary, our school, our voice. When the developers came in the 50s, they told us it was just an old shed, unsafe. They offered to take it off our hands for a pittance. We had no choice but to accept. She pulled out an old, brittle deed, showing the transfer of the hall to the then newly formed Maplewood Heights Land Trust, the precursor to our current HOA, for a shockingly low sum. The deed contained a clause, almost hidden in the legal jargon, that stated the land would be used solely for community, recreation, and benefit, preserving its foundational historical significance. A clause that had been conveniently ignored. The more we uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The Maplewood Community Hall wasn't just an old building. It was one of the earliest independently built African American community centers in the region, a critical hub during the Civil Rights era. Its history had been deliberately obscured when the land was developed in the 50s, a quiet gentrification that wiped away a vibrant Black community. The existence of the Benevolent Society was quietly omitted from official HOA records and property descriptions, effectively erasing its legacy. The dark secret wasn't a wild conspiracy theory. It was a forgotten, uncomfortable truth that could complicate current development plans, expose past discriminatory practices, and potentially even render the HOA's ownership of the hall's land questionable due to a breach of the original deed's covenants. Bea and the developers she was secretly in league with, a group called Maplewood Green Ventures, were not just ignorant. They were actively suppressing this truth for profit, hoping to capitalize on a fresh, untainted slate. Bea, feeling the pressure mount from my persistent inquiries and Sarah's initial soft-pedal questions around the neighborhood, doubled down. She declared me a troublemaker in the community newsletter, accusing me of harassing residents and spreading misinformation. She even tried to ban Sarah from HOA property, citing unauthorized solicitation. Her rhetoric became increasingly unhinged, her voice often rising in pitch when challenged, her jewelry jingling like a nervous cashier, constantly drawing attention, yet somehow overlooked. She began scheduling emergency executive sessions where, I later learned, she was pushing for a quick, irreversible demolition date, hoping to destroy the evidence before we could fully present it. She even tried to get a temporary restraining order against me, claiming I was stalking her. It was absurd, but it showed her desperation. The climax arrived at a special emergency HOA meeting called by Bea to finalize the demolition contract. She had pushed it through on short notice, hoping to catch us off guard. The room, the main clubhouse, was packed. Residents buzzed with excitement about the promised new facilities, oblivious to the storm brewing. Bea stood at the podium, basking in the attention, her smile wide and artificial, almost grotesque. "Tonight," she declared, her voice booming through the cheap speaker system, "we close one chapter and begin another, a brighter future for Maplewood Heights. The contract for the demolition of the old hall is on the table. All in favor?" "Before we close any chapters, Madam President," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the rising chorus of ayes, "I believe we need to read a few more pages from the past." A ripple went through the room. Heads turned. Bea's artificial smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. Behind me, Sarah, with a camera crew from the local news discreetly positioned at the back, gave me a subtle nod. I clicked a remote, and onto the large projection screen behind Bea, the old, sepia-toned photographs appeared. Images of jubilant black families, community leaders, children playing, and the hall standing proud. Bearing a hand-painted sign that read Benevolent Society Hall, the contrast to Bea's sleek renderings was stark. Sarah began distributing copies of her investigative piece, hot off the press, detailing the hall's true history, the obscured land deeds, and the apparent attempts to erase it. Murmurs erupted. Bea's face went from smug confidence to a sickly white, then a mottled crimson. "This is irrelevant," she shrieked, her voice cracking, reaching a shrill crescendo. "These are fabrications. A smear campaign by a disgruntled resident and a sensationalist journalist." She frantically banged her gavel, a desperate, frantic rhythm against the rising tide of discontent. "Order! I demand order!" But then Mrs. Gable, frail but resolute, rose slowly from her seat in the front row. The room fell silent. "That building," she said, her voice clear and strong, though tinged with emotion, "was built brick by my grandfather. He poured his sweat and his dreams into those walls. It was a place where we dreamed of a better tomorrow, where we celebrated, where we organized, where we found strength when nobody else would have us. You can't erase that. You can't erase us." Her quiet dignity was more powerful than any shouting. The room erupted. Whispers turned into shouts. Residents, now seeing the truth laid bare before them, felt manipulated, ashamed, and deeply betrayed. The contractors, looking increasingly uncomfortable, started packing up their documents, their faces pale. Bea tried to regain control, banging her gavel, threatening legal action against anyone disrupting official HOA business. Her jewelry jingled like a nervous cashier, constantly drawing attention, yet somehow overlooked, as if mocking her frantic attempts at composure. But it was too late. Sarah stepped forward, mic in hand, her camera crew moving into position. "President Maxwell," she pressed, her voice calm and authoritative. "Are you denying the historical significance of this building, or the fact that this history was conveniently omitted from the records you provided to the community? And why were these original deeds obscured?" Bea sputtered, her face a mask of furious indignation, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. I had no knowledge. This is an attack, a personal attack. And what about the lucrative development contract you signed with Maplewood Green Ventures?" I interjected, pulling out a printout of the contract I'd obtained through a public records request. Projected onto the screen beside Mrs. Gable's photo. "Company, incidentally, where your husband is listed as a major shareholder, and which stands to profit massively from this demolition and redevelopment. A company that also happens to own the very firm you hired for demolition." That was the knockout blow. The murmurs turned into a full-blown uproar. Calls for her resignation, demands for an immediate investigation, shouts of fraud. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Bea, utterly defeated, stood frozen for a moment. Then, without a word, simply turned and walked out, her helmet of hair slightly askew. The gavel lay abandoned on the podium. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. The local news ran Sarah's story as their lead for days, creating a public outcry that reached county and even state officials. The community, horrified by the historical cover-up and the blatant corruption, demanded Bea's immediate removal. An emergency vote of no confidence was held, and she was ousted unanimously, her reign ending not with a bang, but with the quiet dignity of a community reclaiming its truth. The developers, Maplewood Green Ventures, facing public backlash, massive legal challenges for attempting to destroy a historical site, and investigations into their business practices, quickly pulled out of the deal. The DA's office did eventually press charges against Bea for embezzlement and fraud, resulting in a plea deal, hefty fines, a lengthy probation, and a very public downfall. Justice, in its slow, methodical way, was served. Bea Maxwell, the HOA Queen, learned that some histories refuse to be buried. Maplewood Heights is a different place now. The oppressive atmosphere is gone, replaced by a sense of genuine camaraderie and mutual respect. The old hall, once slated for demolition, is now undergoing a painstaking restoration led by community volunteers, historical preservationists, and funded by grants, to become the Maplewood Heights Heritage Center, a place for everyone to learn, reflect, and celebrate the rich, complex history of our town, including the forgotten contributions of the Colored Citizens Benevolent Society. Mrs. Gable, a quiet hero, is now an honored consultant on the project, her stories and photographs becoming central to the hall's narrative. The HOA itself has been reformed, with new, transparent bylaws and a board truly dedicated to serving the community, not ruling it. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to look beyond the surface, to question authority, and to fight for what's right. And sometimes, the most satisfying victory isn't just about winning a battle, but about unearthing a forgotten truth and building a stronger community on the foundations of honesty and shared history. So, what's the craziest HOA story you've ever encountered? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of entitlement getting its just desserts.